Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Strength and Weakness podcast, the Messy Home from Home edition. If you joined us on our last podcast, you had the pleasure of hearing that our messy moments consisted of both Ellen and I and our families having the stomach flu. We will not bore you with all of the details, just in case, like we mentioned, you may be eating or doing something that your tummy could become a little queasy.
Yeah.
But needless to say, we both spent a lot of time near the bathrooms of our house. I will just give you a really funny story. We live in a house with one bathroom.
Oy.
And as you could imagine, a family of 5 all having the stomach bug at the same time could pose some problems. Luckily, we did not have any direct encounters, but we did have some close calls. And this was the funniest part, was that my husband and I both got hit with the stomach bug in the middle of the night within 15 minutes of each other.
Oh.
And I literally was laughing so hard when I looked back. I was like, oh my gosh, if I would have gotten sick 15 minutes later, like, I'm not sure I know what would have happened. Like,
It was a bit of a traffic jam on the way to
Yeah,
the bathroom, I bet,
a
right?
little bit of a traffic jam. And also, like, legitimately, what would be my options? I mean, I just put some thought into that for the next time, just in case we all
Yeah.
get the stomach bug again. But I was really sad in my bleaching abilities because I really thought that I got everything so that we wouldn't get sick. But it's one of those things, if you have kids, you just kind of like embrace it and you're like, all right,
We're all in this together. We're going
we're
down
all in
together.
this together.
Yeah. I feel that too. I remember when
Yeah.
COVID happened, someone was like, what are you going to do? Like, if your kids get COVID, I was like, if one gets it, we all get it. We are going down together.
If anything, I try to speed up the process. I'm like, everybody in the same room, share the water bottles,
Sneeze
share
in
the
my
drinks.
face. Come here.
Luckily, my oldest, my 6.5-year-old, did not get sick.
Wow.
I was shocked.
Miracle.
I know. It was pretty amazing. So
Wow.
Good for her.
Yeah, good for her.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Those of you who are listening, we are stepping into a little bit of our own messy moment as a podcast with this topic, because today we're going to be talking about, should Christians apologize to the LGBTQ community for how they have historically been treated. Now, before you tune us out, get really angry and turn off the podcast, our intention for this podcast is to really help you navigate compassion and conviction when interacting with the gay community. Because I think sometimes if you've been somebody who has been mistreated, or you have friends who have been mistreated by Christians, you can be overly compassionate, overly empathetic, and we'll talk about that. Or if you're somebody who feels like, I need to hold to the Bible and I cannot waver on my conviction, and you've been really strong in your stance and maybe hurt some people in the gay community, we want to talk about that side too. So, right, we live in a world right now that is highly, highly separated and segmented and divided, and we're only moving more in that direction. How, as Christians, can we bridge the gap and live in the tension of compassion and conviction?
Yeah, amen. I think that's what kind of what we try to do as a ministry as a whole is, right. I love how you said that. We're so polarized as a society, especially on this topic. And I think people, in their empathy and compassion for other people, which is such a beautiful and wonderful thing, and something we definitely need to have as Christians. But sometimes it's not that we have too much compassion necessarily. It's just that we allow our compassion to erode our conviction because we feel so bad. And vice versa, sometimes we have conviction, and that's great. We need to know what the Bible says and follow it. But sometimes we can go too far in that, and we can impose that on other people, or our conviction can erode our compassion. And I think what I'm so grateful for is that Jesus gave us an example of both equally. I don't think we can probably embody that model, that example perfectly, because we're human, and though he was human, he was perfect, and we're not. But I think our life as Christians is a constant battle for that messy middle ground. How do I have conviction and compassion and not allow one to erode the other?
So, Ellen, let's set the stage. Let's take a step back. When we're looking at how the gay community has historically been treated by Christians, what I've seen and what I've heard is that if you are somebody who has really stood your ground in convictions, it could feel something like those who hold, gay people are going to hell signs on the side of the road. Those
Hmm.
are people who have very little compassion and maybe even very little interaction with the gay community on
Yes.
that side. Would you agree, disagree on that? And then we'll get to the other side of the spectrum. But any other gaps you want to fill in?
Yeah, no, I love how you said that, that usually a lack of compassion comes from a lack of understanding and therefore a lack of curiosity. And so I think that if we can hold conviction, which stems from our love for God and our passion and devotion to God, which is so good, but if we can hold that conviction with a genuine respect and curiosity for people and their experiences, then we don't have to be afraid. Like I encounter a lot of Christians who are afraid to get curious about an LGBTQ person's experience because they're afraid that even just by listening to their experience, that will take away something from their conviction. They'll be neglecting their conviction in some way. And I think we see the exact opposite with Jesus. Like he sat with the sinners, he ate with them, he wanted to understand them, but that never changed his conviction. That never changed his perspective, how he lived, who he was devoted to. So I think if we can stand in the security of our conviction, of our love for God and his love for us, then we can freely get curious about other people. And it's through that curiosity that we really develop compassion for people.
Yeah, and let's just throw a wrench here. For those people who have a hard time engaging with those in the gay community, don't you find it interesting that they also may encounter people who don't live up to other convictions they may have? Let's just say premarital sex. Okay.
Right.
I hate to break it to a lot of people, but most of the people that you interact with who may not be in your church community have most likely had premarital sex. Let's just throw a number out, maybe 80% or more. And so I think what's hard for me is when people stand their ground and say, gay people need to live this way, or they are sinning, they're not living the way the Bible is. It breaks my convictions. They're not holding, in that tangent, in that direction. Why do they not also stand that ground in this relationship with other people who are also not living? And I mean, the list is endless. It's not just premarital sex. It's selfishness, debauchery. It's any of that. What do you think is the biggest discrepancy there is it a lack of awareness? Is it maybe their own bias towards the gay community? Is it a disgust towards the gay community? Help me understand from your experience why you see that. If we're talking historically to the gay community, why is it just so pointed and so negative toward that community?
Yeah, I think it's probably not just one thing. I think it's probably multiple things. One thing that comes to mind, sort of not in defense of that, but kind of to bolster that a bit, is I think every person, every church kind of has to decide, are theological matters related to sex, sexuality, and gender primary or secondary, right? I think there's a lot of people out there that would say it's primary. There's a lot of people out there that would say it's not God's highest and best. I hear that a lot. It's not God's highest and best, but I don't think it'll keep you from going to heaven or keep you from living a life as a Christian. And so I think every person has to kind of wrestle with that, and every church certainly has to make that kind of theological distinction. So I would say I view sex, sexuality, and gender as more of a primary issue, and I think it's because so much of our identity as God's image bearers is related to sex, sexuality, and gender. Those are extreme metaphors he uses in Scripture to describe the kind of intimacy he wants to have with us. And there's something about our gender that helps to make up our image-bearing status as men and women in God's image. So I think that could be part of it, right? Maybe there's something about this that really stirs our spirit because there is something so primary, so innate about sex, sexuality, and gender that has to do with our connection with God. I certainly don't think that's any excuse for mistreatment. That definitely goes against God's ways. But I think all coupled with historically this just not being as prominent as it is in our current day and age, and us as a people, really as a human race, marginalizing those that we don't understand. What we don't understand is inherently threatening to us. And so we like to marginalize those kinds of people right away and say, you're bad, you're gross, you're ugly, you're terrible, so that we don't have to engage in this tension of conviction and compassion, right? It's a very uncomfortable place to be. And so to keep us from having to live in that tension, we like to just right straight away, put those people on the edges and say, you're the fringe of society, you're terrible, you're going to hell, all this terrible stuff, right?
Yeah.
And so I think there is a legitimacy to it in our spirit, but I think that those people who have marginalized LGBTQ people are taking it way too far and really engaging in an earthly practice that is certainly not heavenly at all.
Yeah. And I know I warned our listeners at the beginning that we were going to live in this messy middle. I don't know about any of the listeners, but as you were just talking, I felt the tension when you talked about marginalized.
Yes.
I was like, okay, take a deep breath, right? Because I think there are things that
Yeah.
are important to us that can trigger some of those. So if that's you, feel free, take a pause, take a deep breath, stay with us. We'll get to the good
Send
stuff
us an
at the
email.
end.
We want to hear from you. Yeah.
So now looking at the opposite side of the spectrum, right? We've talked about those who tend to be more legalistic in their conviction, that lack compassion. But you're talking about the both sides, right? So let's talk through maybe some people who tend to be too compassionate. What I typically see when people are falling on compassion without conviction, usually have really close friends or family who have been mistreated or mistreated by the church or somebody who claims to be a Christian. And therefore, they kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater and they're like, well, I am going to stand behind the person that I love and the person that I care about. And therefore, I don't know if the Bible really means that, or they work really hard to find a loophole to make it feel better to support them that doesn't conflict with what they used to believe or maybe still believe from a Christian belief stance.
Well, I would say to that, I wouldn't call that compassion, because compassion is limitless. We can have an unlimited amount of compassion. I think we see that with Jesus. Compassion, true love and compassion has boundary, right? It knows where I end and where you begin. What you're describing, what I see a lot, is actually called enmeshment, and it comes from too much empathy. Empathy is, I'm in this with you. Compassion is, I'm here with you as you're going through this. Empathy is, I'm here in this with you. And empathy has its place. It's such a wonderful thing, but we can only offer empathy in much smaller increments than we can compassion, because compassion has that boundary. So I think we have to make that distinction, because when we say, I have so much compassion for what you're going through, I want to understand, I'm curiously compassionate about your experience, even though I could never understand it, I could never take away the pain, right? That's what compassion does, is it says, I don't have the power to take this pain away for you, but I do have the ability to offer you companionship in it to better understand, even if not perfectly. And I think that's the distinction that people who are allowing their compassion or enmeshment or empathy to erode their conviction need, is that boundary to say, and again, it goes back to that grief, which we talked about in our last episode. Along with this comes some grief to say, I would do anything to take this pain away from my loved one or from this person, even I've never met, whom I love. I just don't have that power. We don't live in Eden. You are going to experience brokenness. I'm going to experience brokenness. And so is everyone else in this world. And that's going to create rippling pain for all of us. And there is just this existential grief that will always come along with that. If we get adept at grieving that, then we can more easily say, I have compassion in what you're experiencing, and I want to understand as best as I can, but I'm going to have to surrender your pain to you and God, because I don't have any power there. And then we're freed up to have our own conviction, even if someone doesn't understand it well.
Yeah. And you just summed up what I was thinking as you were going through this, right? What I hear is the perfect pairing is the compassion that has boundaries with the commitment to the conviction, that I can have my own conviction and still interact with a community that I might not agree completely with, right?
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that my compassion has to stop there.
I love that. Like, I totally agree. I don't think that we need to walk into relationship with LGBTQ people with our tail between our legs, ashamed of our conviction, hiding our beliefs. But we
Yeah.
certainly don't need to walk in assured that we already know who they are and already know their experience. Like, we can still enact that curious compassion while we hold resolutely to our personal conviction without imposing that conviction on anyone else.
Some people maybe have mastered being able to live in this tension, but I think
Mm.
what is our hope and our takeaway from this episode is that we can understand that um, if the time comes that you can show compassion to somebody who's been hurt in the gay community, we encourage you to take that. We
Yeah.
encourage you to implore that, especially if it's somebody who is close to you and that you love, that you feel empowered to uphold your convictions and also have compassion with boundaries, and that
Mm.
you don't feel like you have to live on one side or the other. But we can also acknowledge that it's a really hard place to be and comes with a lot of tension and a lot of roller coasters. But
The
we
messy
also want to
middle.
be here. Yeah, the messy middle. We want to be here
Messy.
to support you. And so, yeah, we would love to hear from you. If you have any thoughts, questions, like we said, we don't have all the answers here, as we don't in most of our podcasts. But we are glad that you decided to join us today for this conversation. And we look forward to seeing you next time.